we're going to continue our how to use Microsoft Excel. This chapter is going to emphasize chapter 3, logical and lookup functions. This is going to be fun. I think you're going to really learn a lot from this chapter. And for some of you who already have advanced knowledge of Excel, you may find some areas where you can refine your skill and possibly maybe learn something new. So let's get started. We are going to use freeze panes command. And again, it's really important when you're dealing with a huge database to be able to lock a pane in place so that you can still navigate throughout the rest of the chapter. So it does help make it visually easy to navigate through a very large workbook by freezing the panes. We're going to review construction and use of formulas. We're going to go through some basic functions and some financial functions. We're going to learn how to construct a logical test to evaluate contents in a location. We're going to be using if statement or if functions and or functions and multiple logical tests. So this is going to be a more complex chapter. So I'm going to break it up a little bit more when you're doing your module, simply because we want to be able to understand one step before we proceed to the other steps. So this chapter is probably the most technical of all 4 chapters, and you'll understand that as we go on. We're going to use the and function and the if function together. And it's extremely neat how you can actually evaluate the contents of various cells by using these functions. We're going to nest in our cells some nested if functions and evaluate more than one logical test. So it gets quite complicated. I mean, it really does show a long list of different functions that you could put in one cell to tell you how to format or to construct a worksheet. So it's going to be very complicated in certain areas, but pretty straightforward in others. So let's work together on these. We're going to set up some conditional formatting rules, and that will be automatically applied. So it's just going to be a neat chapter. So much in this chapter, I have to say. We remember the average function and the count function and the sum functions, but now we're going to attach an if to it. And these if, whenever you say if, that means it's conditional. So these are going to be conditional functions. If it meets a certain condition, you do this. If it doesn't meet it, then do this, that type of thing. So that's going to be extremely neat. So we're going to take our count and average and sum functions and add a little twist to it. And then we're going to also extend it to count ifs. And again, non-blank cells within a criteria against another logical test. But again, these are just a basic count functions, average functions with a little twist to it. The same with average ifs and sum ifs. Something new for many people that I've seen is the Vlookup function. And what this function does is it allows you to display the contents of a cell under a certain condition. You're going to go look up something and place it somewhere else. And the same with Hlookup. And you'll learn the differences between the Vlookup and the Hlookup. And we're going to also create web queries that we can import into our worksheet. Very, very neat activities in this chapter. So what is one of the logical functions? A freeze pane command allows you to scroll across a worksheet while keeping row headings or column headings fixed. And that's important when you're trying to deal with a lot of information and you still need to have grasp of what the column headings say. You want to keep those frozen. You don't want them to move while you scroll down in your worksheet. When you have a really huge worksheet, it really does help. And we're going to use the investment detail worksheet throughout this chapter for purposes of helping you to utilize some of these functions. So everything is going to be in from the investment detail or the investment summary worksheet when we evaluate our functions and formulas. The purpose of a logical test is to evaluate the contents. A logical test is true, false, yes, no, that type of thing. So we're going to use these comparison operators to see if something is true, and if it isn't, what to do next. If functions are used to produce a custom output based on results. So again, what you want to do is use the if function, which is going to be true or false kind of thing, or yes or no kind of thing, is to say whether or not this test that I'm asking you to perform in a form of a function, is it true? And it will go through its process and tell you if it's true. But when it's false, you want to tell it what to do. So not only if it's true, you want it to display a specific item, but you also want to do something when it's false. The or function is if it is or that. It doesn't have to be both, or it's either one or the other. So the answer is again it's gonna follow the same format, true or false. But the or function really commonly works well within the if function, and it does allow a function to be more defined, the output to be more defined. The and function is very much like an or function, but it's saying the output has to be yes in both cases, not yes in one and no in the other. But if the and function says and this plus this, or this and this, so the answer has to be yes to both. Otherwise, the output would be false. Sometimes nested if functions are used to when you want to have more than one possible output. And these are far more advanced topics, and I would love to know from you whether or not you've used the nested if functions and how they worked well in your workplace or your school or home when evaluating your spreadsheets. They're not commonly used, but they are extremely valuable functions within Excel, and is used with finance professionals when they're evaluating massive amount of data and going through each and every cell is illogical, quite frankly. So nested if functions does help them navigate worksheets quite easily. And using the and or can also be done in the same function, and it's actually very, very neat to see. It makes the actual function a little bit more involved to create, but you make it very easy to deal with a very large a complex worksheet. But you will really have to be careful when using this, because it does become hard to be accurate when you're putting these functions in, because the commas have to be used in a certain way and parentheses you have to use in a certain way. So the ands or functions can be very, very complicated, and it is a chore to manage those type of functions within your worksheet. Conditional formatting, and if or functions are used to evaluate the cells and apply some formatting treatment. Again, if you have these functions used in your workbook, you want them to test it, and then you want it to do something, whether it's to put the answer in a different cell, or format something differently, or color a different items, whatever you want it to do, but it has to meet the test. Placing quotation marks for logical functions. That is important. The quotation marks, we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail so you can see what it looks like. But when you put a quotation marks, that means that if the answer is true or false, whatever your function tell it, you're going to tell it to put a something, whatever it is, within those quotation marks in that cell. And that's very, very important. And you're going to see that when we're working through the workbook, the investment detail, when you're trying to evaluate the performance of a particular stock. And you'll say either if it's doing well, you will hold it. If it's not doing well, you will sell it, or that type of thing. So putting those quotation marks around your logical functions tell the function what to place if the function, if it's correct, if it's true, or if it's false. And we'll get lots of examples of what that means in later when you see some examples and when you see some demonstrations within the website. So using logical functions to evaluate percentages. And all it does is you're using the percent symbol and you're defining the logical test. You can use this also to convert a percentage to a decimal in a logical test. Again, it's just what you're doing is telling it if it meets a certain condition, what to do with the value in that cell. Here are some questions I think you should review as you go through the test and as you practice with a blank worksheet or with the investment worksheet examples in your text, just to get an idea of how to use an if statement, and what happens when you put information in incorrectly, what kind of results you get. Here's another question that I think you will be able to answer correctly once you determine how to use the if functions. What is the correct foundation? What is the correct function that will give you the result that you're seeking? Again, using logic and common sense, Most importantly, when you're working with worksheets, it's important that you test the logic of what you've done. Don't just assume that it's correct. Scan through your worksheet to make certain that the information that is giving you, or the output that it's deriving from your logical test, is what in fact is true. So go through and be sure that it's correct. The count and function and the count function are being contrasted. What makes them different is, one, the count function only counts the number of cells in a range of numerical data. The COUNTIF function counts the number of cells in a range that contain numeric or text data. Huge difference. The COUNTIF function also allows you to selectively count cells in a range based on a specific criteria. And I'm going to emphasize right here the if portion that's right there at the end of count. So there are two different ways that they are different, and you will use both. If obviously gives you that option of whether or not it's a conditional type of formatting, and this one here, the count only wants to deal with numerical data. It's very, very important distinction between the two, because I think you'll be tested when you're working on your different assignments. So the count function contains arguments, the range and criteria. Understanding the range, and that's just the specific cells that you want to count. The criteria is going to be the argument that you define. What is your goal? What are you going to decide that if a cell range should be included in the output? Very important. The argument is going to be important. The range argument is going to be important, and the criteria argument is going to be important. And knowing which information to provide in each cell is very important to get the correct output. Average if works a lot like count if. It is identical to the average. But the difference, I would say, would be you have to give, it's a conditional difference between average and average if. It's more conditional than the Pane average function. You're going to average it if it meets the criteria that you tell it. It also differs from the count if function because it allows you to find two cell ranges instead of just one. The range will have to pertain to the criteria that will be used, and the second has to contain the values that will be used to calculate the mean. So it's a little bit more involved, but I think it's still intuitive, and I don't think it will be much of a complicated function to carry out in your workbooks, and you will have lots of opportunities to practice that skill. So, and just a heads up, you will be using the average if function when you're working on your portfolio summary sheet, when you're calculating the average length of each investment. Again, this is an overview presentation. As you proceed with the readings of this chapter, you'll find different areas where you can practice step by step each one of these functions that we're going over in this presentation. SUMIF is very, very similar to the SUM function. I would say the biggest difference is going to be the fact that the SUMIF is going to be a conditional. SUMIT if it meets a criteria that you give it. And there has some similarities between the average if and the SUMIF function. And as you see, once you learn one, I would suspect to say the other functions would be just as easy to learn because they follow a very, very systematic approach. And again, we're talking about the two different functions here, the SUMIF and the COUNTIF functions. And this just allows you to look at multiple sets of criteria. Again, when you put the S on the end, and we're being English-speaking people, the S obviously gives you that cue that it is going to be plural, meaning more than one. The same in this case with the S on the end is more of a multiple set of criteria instead of one. Same logic. So that's what I love about Microsoft Excel. They don't really defy human reasoning. They are very intuitive in the sense of how these functions work. And some of them work very much in complement with one another. Some of them are in contrast to one another, but they do follow a rational and systematic purpose. And I would think that you will have no problems with these functions. I would say Chapter 6 is more complicated because there are at least 10 different types of functions that you'll be using in addition to the functions that you've used in chapters 1 and 2. That will make it more complicated. But the questions and the assignments that you'll be performing in this class will be emphasizing the newer functions, the sum, the SUMIF, the average ifs, the ands, the ifs, and the or functions, and using those new functions in addition to using the functions that you have used in Chapter 2. So we'll emphasize the new functions. We will use the functions in the prior chapters as the complement. Um, so that won't be too difficult, but I would say go through each one of the functions and familiarize yourself with what they do and why they are used, and understand what criteria or argument that's necessary to calculate or use those functions to get the correct calculation. Understand also how to deal with errors if they do occur, and it's very much a frequency, because using these if and or count ifs or average functions requires a specific type of arguments, and using commas in the right way will allow you to get the output that you desire. Therefore, error messages alert you to the fact that there may be an error in the way your function is written. That is going to be the critical part of this chapter, understanding how to write these specific functions in a specific cell so that it will not error out, and it will give you the information that you are seeking so that you can make the right decision. Here are a few questions I think you should review as you're going through this chapter. And if you don't get them correct, go back. And the reason I say that is because I want you to make certain that you understand the conceptual framework of this particular chapter and before tackling all of the practice problems. So reading with and answering a few multiple choice questions will help you understand what areas that you're not understanding, and go so that you can go back and review again. The Vlookup and the Hlookup are two new functions that many people don't use a lot, and I'm hoping with this chapter you'll see a use for it in your daily life. The Vlookup function allows you to access data in another cell or another worksheet or workbook. What it does, it looks for something. It's looking for something, and you want it to display something that exists in another worksheet or workbook. It is a versatile function and eliminates the need to copy information that exists in another workbook, so it's efficient. It also is important because it will vertically look down in the first column of range of cells to find what it is called a lookup value. That's a very important distinction here. Again, with this new function that you'll be going through in the chapter, the main point is to know what it is, what it does, and how to use it technically correct in a worksheet, in a cell specifically. And it's very much like a statistical function, but instead of selecting a number, it's only looking for one thing. So that's really important. So this is kind of important to know what this function does and what it does not do. Hlookup is another function that's very similar to the Vlookup. I would say it looks horizontally, and it looks horizontally to an array of information on a table. It looks to find a match, a lookup value that it's going to display in an area where you tell it. And it tells you how many rows below the first row of the table that the function should display. So there's a distinction between the Vlookup and the Hlookup. And we will practice that because those two functions are not commonly used, and they're very much misunderstood. So we're going to look at those and explore how they're used so that when we use them in our worksheets, we have the correct formula. Web queries are another little small subsection of this chapter, and it allows you to export information from a website to your Excel, and we'll go through how to do that. One of the things we'll be using in this particular class practice is looking up a stock price for a specific company to input into an investment detail worksheet. It is fairly straightforward, and we will go through that in detail. And what this point is making the worksheet data entry process as efficient as possible. There's no reason why you can't just key in the stock price. You go into the website to Yahoo Finance or wherever, MSN Finance, look up a company and put the stock price in. But knowing that you can use web queries to do that makes it a little bit more efficient and less cumbersome. So it's not a wrong or right, it's not a good or a bad, it's just a different way of doing things. So in the end of the day, using the range in the proper way is going to be the most critical advice I would give any student for this chapter. Being very careful of the arguments and how they are required to be used within Excel. using those references in the right way, using the commas and these quotations in the correct format. Otherwise, you'll get error codes. And you need to know what to do when you get an error code. So you don't want to just crash and burn, but you certainly want to know what kinds of problems that you could encounter when you're using these very complex or unfamiliar functions within Excel. So knowing that, knowing how to find out what the error is important. So that when you see that your Excel spreadsheet is doing something that you did not anticipate, how do you find the answer? So this is just an example of what you look for or what kind of errors will pop up when you make a mistake in the functions. Here are a few questions that I suggest you go through. They'll help you reinforce your knowledge. They take a form of little mini quizzes in your text. But again, it's the main point that I'm making here is as you read, answer a few questions after each different section that we review to ensure that you have grasped the material well and what areas that you may need to review and reread. This chapter is probably the most complex of the 4 chapters. Take your time going through them. Review the tutorials and the skill test demonstrations. They will be very, very critical for you as a student to understand and to practice on your own how to create these worksheets that have many nested if statements and Vlookup and other functions that we are covering in this chapter. As again I say, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you later.